Hello everyone, my name is Paul Clements and I'm going to read a short excerpt from my travel book Shannon Country, A River Journey Through Time, which is published by the Lilliput Press. The book looks at the River Shannon from a topographical and historical point of view, and it considers what it means to people today. Rivers are a rich source of material for writers, and they have always exerted a powerful grip on their imagination. They provide the ideal vehicle since there is a beginning, a middle and an end. In this case, it's from the Shannon Pot in Cavan to the estuary beyond Limerick. The Shannon is perfectly calibrated to the requirements of travel writing, as it follows a ready-made linear journey. But it also meanders and wanders freely. So this excerpt is from about halfway through Shannon Country. Throughout my travels, I have seen the river in different lights, becoming familiar with its many paradoxes as Ireland's most famous watercourse. Slow and ponderous, the Shannon is laden with memories, powerful in symbolism, prone to running rampant through fields and swamping houses, sometimes impeccably well behaved and relaxed, at other times tempestuously alive, unpredictable, twisting and turning, eroding and evolving, secluded, glimpsed yet neglected, at times frustratingly unget-atable, filled with religious and cultural significance, and, according to Celtic mythology, possessor of wisdom. Shannonsiders, I have discovered, are amongst the greatest talkers in the world, possibly since the Greeks, and people who love rivers love to talk about them. The physiognomy of the Shannon has long interested scientists and experts on flood control. In the mid-1950s, an American Army engineer was brought in by the Irish government following severe flooding of the river. Colonel Louis Rydell of the US Army Corps of Engineers had experience of taming the Mississippi down to New Orleans. He spent a considerable time working out the channels to be dredged in the Shannon and its tributaries, and suggested an aggressive approach. His report reflected the complexities of the situation, overdraining and dredging, and before he moved on to tackle the Indus in Pakistan, he conceded that the difficulties were immense, needing much further study. But he emphasized the navigation, fisheries, recreation and wildlife potential of the Shannon, which he considered to be one of the world's great rivers. From Banagher, the Crank Road to Victoria Lough has a timeless quality. It passes a disused canal, ancient bridges, a long-forgotten derelict loch, and throws up mysterious and largely unseen watery worlds. The road bends, kinks and weaves with offshoots leading down inviting boreens, before shrinking into a single track and degenerating into pothole tarmac with a grassy central strip. In the olden days of the 1970s, drivers referred to them as potholes, but the new prosaic term is roads with severe structural distress, consisting of deep craters, crumbling surfaces, and in some cases, roads that are undrivable because of a plague of potholes. Instead of listening to Shannonside radio, I changed frequency, tuning into the Shannonside aviation soundscape by putting down the car window. When I step outside, all around is movement and restlessness. There's an energizing chill to the air, which is fizzing with courtship and saturated in birdsong. Across the trees, hedges and fields, a chain of chinking blackbirds echoes over the landscape, reverberating off stone and metal bridges. All along the road and waterways, the songs are repetitive, comical and cackling as the birds try to find their rhythm. Part of my quest is to try to see a kingfisher, and with binoculars I scan a large body of water across a bridge where overhanging branches are a particular delight for the birds. But to my chagrin, the kingfisher continues to play hide and seek. The single-story Victoria Lough, dating from the 1840s, replaced Hamilton Lock and is an impressive example of canal architecture. It was built to accommodate large Shannon steamers carrying passengers in the mid-19th century. Stephen Mcgarry, the full-time lockkeeper, is a softly spoken man wearing a navy jumper proclaiming Waterways Ireland. He agrees there is a mysterious allure about Crank Road, which he says is lost in time. Stephen has held down his lockkeeping position for over 2 decades, although the same position has presided in his family for more than 100 years, stretching back 4 generations. The practicalities of the role may not have fundamentally altered, but the river is deeply imbued in his bloodstream, and he brings a note of authenticity about its history. His great-grandfather came down from Leitrim in 1906. He was a lockkeeper, and his son took over from him, and in turn his son passed it on to Stephen. He talks about the birds which he has seen diving for aquatic insects or small fish, and says he has spotted kingfishers many times on the back canals where there are fewer boats. They're in and out, Stephen says, opening their wings on impact with the water, zooming around with a flash of blue, and you can also see all sorts of ducks and waders here, such as golden plover. On cue, we transfer our gaze to a fast-flying, tight-knit party of 150 plover caught in the morning sunlight, rising, twisting, turning and hurtling in synchrony over the water, like fragments of silver foil, a mesmerizing spectacle. In the automated 21st century world of self-service checkout supermarkets and online banking, where human contact is rejected, Stephen is uncertain about the longer-term future of the keepers of the locks. Smart cards have been introduced at Athlone Lock as part of the rollout of a new testing system. It's already being used along the river for services such as showers, toilets, pump-outs and electricity, so their future is not clear. He reckons there may not be a need for a lockkeeper in 50 or 100 years' time, but he believes that people will still want the personal touch. At one stage there were 14 lockkeepers on the River Shannon, and there are now just 7. Stephen Mcgarry is a latter-day guardian of powerful lineage, holding down a job which has survived into the 21st century against the odds. His office on this stretch of river ranks as one of the Shannon's pockets of bucolic peace, a place that has enchanted his family dynasty for 100 years and remains an atmospheric enclave of land and water. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening to this reading from my book, Yeats Now, Echoing into Life. The idea of the book is that Yeats often has just the right words for significant occasions. Occasions like falling in love, getting married, the birth of a child, celebrating a friend, making a tough decision, getting sick, growing old, facing death, even enduring lockdown during a pandemic. Yeats wrote that a lyric can gain a second beauty, passing, as it were, out of literature into life. Knowing this, he hammered his poems into existence line by line. My book seeks to capture the second beauty of those lines. Once captured, they can echo into life to help us articulate our feelings about significant moments in our lives. Here's a 3-word title that throws the net of words over a moment of reunion. After long silence. 30 years after parting from his first lover, Olivia Shakespeare, Yeats wrote to tell her, "I came upon 2 early photographs of you yesterday while going through my file. One from Literary Yearbook, who ever had a like profile? A profile from a Sicilian coin. One looks back upon one's youth as to a cup that a madman, dying of thirst, left half-tasted. I wonder if you feel like that. The conversation continued in person, and the poem, After Long Silence, tells what happens. Speech, after long silence, it is right. All other lovers being estranged or dead, unfriendly lamplight hid under its shade, the curtains drawn upon unfriendly night, that we descant and yet again descant upon the supreme theme of art and song. Bodily decrepitude is wisdom. Young, we loved each other and were ignorant. The idea that friendship never ends is a recurring one throughout Yeats's poetry, and it's epitomized in two lines that freeze the frame on a moment of friendship. Two girls in silk kimonos, both beautiful, one a gazelle. Friendship never ended for the two women recalled with both affection and bitterness in the poem In Memory of Eva Gore Booth and Con Markowitz. They are fixed forever in the light of evening, Lissadell, great windows open to the south. The poem memorably states two truths. One, a raving autumn shears blossom from the summer's wreath. And the other, its corollary, the innocent and the beautiful have no enemy but time. Beginning in languor and ending in explosion, this is quintessentially a poem to be read aloud. Leonard Cohen memorably opened his performance at Lissadell in 2010 by reciting the first four lines of the poem and then commenting that when he first read them, more than 50 years previously in his hometown of Montreal, I never knew, he said, that my steps would lead me to reciting them here in this place and being sheltered in the spirit of the great master whose lines I just quoted. I was there that rainy night and felt the power of those words and of that moment. The poem's explosive finale is just as memorable as its opening. We the great gazebo built, they convicted us of guilt, bid me strike a match and blow. Paul Muldoon's poem, 7 Middas Street, implicitly reminds us of the wisdom behind the observation attributed to Mallarmé that poems are not made out of ideas, but out of words. Muldoon's poem describes two girls in silk kimonos, both beautiful, one a gazebo. Here is a line that captures the treasure of friendship. Hearers and hearteners of the work. It comes from the poem At Galway Races, which stresses the importance of friends as hearers and hearteners of the poet's work. But the idea applies generally to the energy unleashed by the solidarity of friendship. At Galway Races. There where the course is, delight makes all of the one mind. The riders upon the galloping horses, the crowd that closes in behind. We too had good attendance once, hearers and hearteners of the work. Here are two lines from the short poem Tom O'Roughly. And wisdom is a butterfly, and not a gloomy bird of prey. Yeats explained in a letter that the butterfly is the main symbol of my ring, the ring I always wear. The other symbol is the hawk. The hawk is the straight road of logic. The butterfly, the crooked road of intuition. The hawk pounces, the butterfly flutters. When Yeats received the design for this ring, just before marrying George Hyde Lees, he wrote to the designer that I shall have an explanation for the ring ready always, for I have written a poem to explain it. He wore the ring until George removed it at his death. Now shall I make my soul. This line is part of Yeats's answer to a conundrum with which he wrestled throughout his life. He posed it in two memorable lines of iambic pentameter. The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. In a letter to Olivia Shakespeare, he floated the idea of solving this dilemma by, he said, living like one of those Japanese who in the Middle Ages retired from the world at 50 or so to devote himself to art and letters, which was considered sacred. Yeats announced just such a decision in his poem, The Tower. His words profoundly engaged Samuel Beckett. Returning from the cremation of his old friend Con Leventhal, Beckett stopped, leaned against the wall, and with a glass of wine in his hand, recited from The Tower. Now shall I make my soul, compelling it to study in a learned school, till the wreck of the body, slow decay of blood, testy delirium, or dull decrepitude, or what worse evil come. And here Beckett hesitated, leaned up against the wall, straightened his shoulders, and finished with Yeats's lines that describe what worse evil come. The death of friends, or death of every brilliant eye that made a catch in the breath, seem but the clouds of the sky. I will close with these lines of current and permanent significance. We had fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love. O honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. Yeats wrote these lines while isolated in his tower in the midst of the confusion and violence of civil war. His poem describes his isolation in words that speak directly to our physical and mental predicament during COVID-19 lockdowns. We are closed in, and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Yeats felt, while isolated in his tower with the key turned on uncertainty, an overmastering desire, he wrote, not to grow unhappy or embittered, not to lose all sense of the beauty of nature. He then continued to tell that a stair, our West of Ireland name for a starling, had built in a hole beside my window. The stair provided a perfect metaphor to express the sweetness of love that the isolated poet needed to overcome the bitterness of hate. He constructed his plea to the honeybees, he said, out of the feeling of the moment. Evan Boland's poem, Yeats and Civil War, beautifully captures Yeats's miraculous escape from isolation. She addresses Yeats directly, writing, "Somehow you arranged your escape aboard a spirit ship, which every day hoisted sail out of fire and rape. And on that ship, your mind was stowaway. Whatever we may learn," Boland's poem concludes, "you are its sum, struggling to survive, a fantasy of honey, your reprieve." Thank you very much.
I'm just going to read an extract from Mícheál Ó, as translated into English. And Mícheál Ó, or This Road of Mine in English, was originally published in 1960 by the Irish language publisher Oona. It's written by a very renowned Donegal writer, Seosamh Grianna, and in true, I suppose, Northern style, he launches, as a Donegal man, he launches into his artistic or metaphysical credo or statement at the very beginning of his novel. So where he, I suppose, explains what he understands by art and just what he intended doing in this very original and poetically written novel, I suppose. And he launches into it literally nearly in the first paragraph or two with very highly poeticized language, I suppose. So, okay, this road of mine. They say the truth is bitter, but believe me, it's harsh, and this is why people avoid it. It was early in my life that I saw it stretched out in front of me, the road of my heart's desire, the winding path skirted by peaks more beautiful than any hills found in music, and the breath of wind above more perfect than any earthly breeze. As wine vanquishes water, the old bridge that listens to the whispering stream for as long as first fleeting memories linger, and whitewashed villages set between the early noon and the mouth of the dawn, and sheltered nooks, quiet and peaceful, where one rests and comes to know every living sprig and herb, the scattered roses made of dreams. Ruch na tunne, the thief na finne, smee fechent lingish salia. On the edge of the wave, beside the fin, as I looked on ships upon the sea. The way of no return, that inconstant road between care and fear. Who will tell me that I never walked it? Me, the king of Gaelic poets in this, the 20th century, the era of revival. Who will tell me that I was guided by the words of casual friends most days since I was born? And even if I was always slow to let them guide me, I still found myself halfway between admiration and contempt. You need patience with the likes of me, and I'll tell you now why. And I'm afraid that they still won't understand, even when I give them the truth straight. But then what's the point of me writing this here book if I am to remain misunderstood? And so I'll tell you now why I didn't keep my distance from these casual friends of mine the most of my days, and why I didn't take the path of joy and enchanted wandering as I should have. It's a long time now since I abandoned the armour that most other men sport, a steady job and opinions that stand to you and ensure you fit in with the crowd. Bad as I was, I never had any time for all of that. But then I also had a deep and powerful fear of myself. No wonder when you think that my own crowd were always down on me, as if there was a danger in me that the world could never see. And it was always like that. It was always like this. When someone else caught a cold, they felt sorry for them. If I got one, it was something to be ashamed of, however. If someone else got angry, they were all right, because they knew how to control themselves. But if I got angry, I was a wild bull of a man. If someone else did something untoward and it was quickly forgotten and they got away with it. But if I did something wrong, I never heard the end of it. I don't like this type of Christianity, if Christianity it is, but there's a lot of it in this world. Maybe I had a power in me that I didn't understand. Maybe I still don't understand it. Is it any wonder that I felt myself tied up in 1,000 knots before I'd done anything at all? I ask you. I rebelled. I broke out of schools and colleges. In 1916, I left St. Eunan's with the intention of joining the British Army, but Easter week put an end to that. I disappeared from other colleges too, and yet despite it all, I reached the age of 21 and I had qualified as a school teacher. If it wasn't that I had some bit of guidance from others, if it wasn't that I had a right fear of myself, the truth is that I'd have had no education at all. They didn't understand what drove me deep down, and even if they tried to give me the odd bit of guidance, it was only very rarely. I knew early on that they were trying to break my spirit in reality, and so I was rash and uncontrollable as a consequence. I was wary of others. I also wrote stories that might never have seen print if it wasn't for others, because I've never believed that the poet should prostitute his art. Once my writing became known and others understood I had that gift, which was very rare in the Ireland of my day, the gift of poetry, I think they expected me to share my story with them. I refused, however. They couldn't get a word out of me. I never revealed what was really on my mind. I protected my inner soul. People close to me claimed
Hi. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book, Oona, which is published by Lilliput Press and came out a couple weeks ago. Chapter 81. Where the turf is stacked, near the Fuck the EU garden, in the puddles where the sky is trapped and shimmers, where the fluffy white seed heads burst and cast themselves widely. It's quiet. Illegal dumpers in summer are scarce. Their fridges, miserable and a kilter, have been rusting in ditches, leaking chemicals since midwinter and sit silently accusing. Hikers with their field guides aren't here. Their trails are mainly near the sea. The field is impressively landscaped with fat, burnt umber bars made by the mechanically extruded turf. They are like massive Kit Kats strewn in a tantrum by a giant child. Fertilizer bags packed with cut and dried turf interrupt the rectangular bars at intervals. In the breezes, alder leaves shudder and blink green, gray, indicating rain. Slender birch trunks draw distant verticals, sky white. Dried heather tufts are islanded in recent rain runnels. Beneath drizzle, rain, and heather, the earth is a steady substance. It has a specific gravity, a quality that invites, has invited me all my life. Friable and tangible, it's a place I inhabit with my flesh and my mind, a craved darkness, a refreshment. When life is thin, when I am eked, pale, my skin beaten like linen, it is that crumbly clay that I pack myself in. Its dark is darker than shut eyes, darker than a grave, place where I die and reignite in the quiet and dank, flashing matter like a beat in the earth. So welcome to the Oona virtual book tour, and so happy to have Michelle Gallen here today. So I guess we'll start out. I'm Alice Lyons. This is my book, Oona, Lilliput Press. And this is Michelle Gallen, John Murray original author of Big Girl, Small Town, which, can you hold up Big Girl, Small Town so we can
Okay, Duke. It's also a cover that features lots of red. Two books here.
Yeah. So happy, Michelle, that you're here, and just how's it going during this lock-in phase?
Yeah, I think we're on, I think my family are on something like day 27, day 28. It's almost 4 weeks since we took our kids out of school. We took them out a bit earlier. I mean, once we heard that the virus had transmitted in the community, we just made a family decision to lock down ourselves. And I think the first week was quite tough. I mean, the kids were really happy. They were like, no school, awesome. Mum is a very easygoing teacher. Because I was like, yeah, whatever. Are you adding sweeties and subtracting sweeties? That's brilliant. I think it wasn't too difficult in one sense for our family, because I write from home. My husband works from home anyway. But clearly having the kids at home for most of the day is a new thing. And there were a lot of things around changing how we shop, changing how we communicate with people, and the little things that you take for granted, like I'm going to go to a bookshop and have a coffee and buy a book. Not there. So it's quite, in one way it's so the same, and in another way it's transformed. Yeah, same here. I mean, I'm on my own at the moment, so I can't believe how many hours I'm spending on social media communicating with people. I started to use screen time, and then I just gave up because it was just so frightening how much time I'm spending on WhatsApp with people. But I need to, I just need to. I think, a lot of people are saying they're really envious of artists and writers because we know how to spend time on our own and so on. And I'm not getting any writing done. I'm not getting many creative things done. I'm just kind of, I think the first week was just trying to get my head around what was happening. So much energy was put into just emotionally trying to catch up with myself and just coping, It's getting a little bit easier. I started digging a garden in the backyard, like a zillion other people, and sourdough and all that kind of stuff. These are healthy things, right? These are things that are making us feel like we've a tiny bit of control in a world where we have much less control than we used to. I'm finding it actually quite hard to read. I'm getting some writing done, but I'm finding reading really, I feel like I don't have the energy for it. When I come to something like I really do deep dive into it, I feel really emotional when I'm reading, but I'm not inhaling books the way I was before the lockdown. I was like, I'm going to read so much, and I have a huge pile of reading. But no, I had 3 books on the go, one of which is my copy of Oona, which I'm working through slowly. And I worked my way slowly through The Discomfort of Evening, which is Man Booker nominated, which was amazing.
What's the author of that? Don't know that.
Oh, sorry, it's a translation. She's Dutch. So
Marika something. Yes,
I'm terrible with, I think it took me a year to learn how to say my husband's name, so I'm terrible with any names that aren't, Paddy or Lily. Yeah, but it's an astonishing read. And I'm also reading Fire Starters by Jan Carson. So I've had a sort of 3 books on the go that I've been working through. And Oona was always it's always been my morning time book. I tend to wake up and I read it. And one of the things I'm actually really interested in is sometimes I have books and I just really enjoy them. It's like sitting down with a really good Netflix series, right? Where you just sit down, you watch it, you might even have a glass of wine, it's all awesome. And then there are other books where when I'm reading them, I can feel that something's being knitted in my own head as I read. And I know I had that with Milkman, and I have this with Oona as well, that when I'm reading it, I have to go, well, that was a page, but now I'm going to have to stop and process not just what you've written, but also actually, my own emotional response to what you've written or the things that you've triggered in the book itself. So
that's great to hear.
I feel maybe that's why I'm jumping ahead, but reading and words are very important to me in lockdown. So as are screen.
I feel the same way. Like I was thinking, get lots of reading done. I bought a whole load of books at Books Upstairs, before I went into lockdown. but I've only been able to manage one book, and it's been Tim Robinson's Stones of Arran, which is really strange, just considering that he died a few days ago. Yeah. But I think part of it is because it's so dense, and I can manage a page at a time, and that's about it. And then I kind of, just as you're saying, I need to digest it. And I think it's also because Stones of Arran was really him like walking around the perimeter of Arran Moor, like micrometers at a time. And that's kind of the way that I've got to proceed mentally. Like I just can't move very quickly.
Yeah.
It's, God, an amazing book, and just very sad about his passing. But what an amazing life. What an amazing life.
So one of the things you've done in Oona is you've divided the book up into 99 different parts. Clearly it's not 100. That would be too close to wouldn't it? But I find that, again, it's kind of, when I read one of the sections, and sometimes I don't, sometimes I fire through a few in a sitting, but sometimes I read one. What was the line that killed me one morning? It was, "She held me in her yes heart." There are all these lines that just sort of zing in, and I was wondering, why were you writing? What was the 99 sections about? Is this something that was there from the start? Is it something that came in the editing process?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that because I've mostly written poetry, forms are really important to me. I can only kind of exist and proceed with forms. And as this book started to progress, it was definitely in episodes. And at a certain point, I was kind of, I think when you're writing, you get a sense of how long it's going to be. Maybe you can start to see the horizon of whatever it is you're working on. And when I was seeing that horizon, I was within, I think maybe I was around 60 something episodes. And I thought, well, 100 is something to aim for. That seems doable or digestible or something. And it's something like, whenever I get a commission to write something like 3,000 words, my challenge is to make it exactly 3,000 words.
Yeah. I hear you.
A strange thing. So, and then it just worked out that I think there's 99. Yeah, there's 99 chapters in the book, and then there's the one chapter that does contain the letter O is unnumbered. So there's actually 100, but there's only 99 that are numbered.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think, and I mean, I suppose the thing that's drawn a load of attention is the fact that the book, on the whole, doesn't feature the letter 0, which is I'm not sure who described it as an act of literary bondage, and, which I thought was fascinating, because I'm someone who's really interested in the idea of creativity sometimes actually being stimulated by having strictures. The smaller the box, actually, the more the harder you have to work to make something incredible. So like, how did you sit down and say, hey, I'm going to write a book without an O anywhere? Well, there are a few, but
yeah, it's great. I didn't hear that, an act of literary bondage, but it reminds me of something that Paul Muldoon has said about his own either working with rhyme schemes or any of the elaborate kind of systems he uses in his poetry. He talks about it being like Houdini, and it being an escape artist, kind of creating this stricture, and then the art is trying to escape from it, Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. And that's exactly what happened with me with this. I started to write the book because I wanted to write about the experience of not being in touch with oneself at some very, very deep level. And it was certainly an experience that I knew from myself. And I wanted to me, it felt like something that read enough about, or if it has been written about, I haven't come across the books yet. And so I wanted to write that book where I'd recognize myself, because I think for me, that's what reading is so much about, is about recognition and connection, you know. So that's how I started the book. And then as I was writing, and it became a fictionalized story, and the main character, her name was Oona, it was just one of those weird ideas that just comes across your mind, where I just thought, well, what if I just like took half of her away, because that's really what I'm trying to write about, is somebody who's kind of gone. And so then it was just a little game, like, okay, well, let me try and write a few sentences without O. And then it just became fun. And I think it was just like that Muldoon thing of like the joy of trying to escape from the bondage. And then it became fun. And for me, when it's fun, it's good. I mean, fun, like I'm sure, like, you know, writing isn't always fun, but there was enough pleasure in it for me every day that I wanted to keep coming back again and again to it. And that's how.
Yeah, I guess it's like it's a intellectual puzzle as much as anything else. So you have you're exploring a really emotional subject, but you've got this incredible discipline that's almost keeping you on a tightrope, so you're not going to veer off. It's kind of a safe way to explore such terrifying or triggering emotions, I imagine.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So maybe it brings you, maybe if you want to use the metaphor of diving deep, it keeps bringing you back to the surface, to the language itself. Like, okay, I'm down here in this kind of very emotional territory, but I'll come up and see what word I can find that means room, that doesn't have two O's in it.
Yeah. What is it? Room, love, mother. The words that are hard to replace. I was quite interested though, because my book features, you know, a missing father and the huge impact that has on the protagonist, Mícheál Ó. And she still has her mother, and I think, to be brutally honest, if Mícheál had her choice, she'd probably swap the mother and the father out. But in Oona, the protagonist does still have her father, but he's absent. No, he's a void in and of himself.
Yeah, completely. I mean, he's mentioned very little in the book, but what little mention of him there is, he's absent. He's gone. We don't really know what happens to him, but he's checked out in some fundamental way. Yeah.
But he's an absent father, so in the sense that I don't feel that he has a huge presence in the book, in that he's trying to tell the protagonist what to do, or trying to mold her life, or holding her up to anything except a silence on the mother's death. And in Mícheál Ó, or in Big Girl Small Town, poor old Mícheál Ó's grandmother has just died, and she very much does not want to talk about the death. She doesn't really want to go into that. She doesn't want to talk about where her father might be, or whether he's living or dead, or what happened. Mícheál Ó would quite like to close these conversations down. But in your book, the damage is done by not having those discussions around what's missing. By, you know, I mean, one of the things about the book that was so attractive to me is the idea of writing something without an O, the technical achievement in that, and it drew me in. But the absence is what's left is very beautiful, and is an incredible technical achievement, but there's a huge absence throughout it, and that is a point of interest, if you know what I mean. It demands to be talked about. It demands to be focused on. Yeah. So I was wondering about the theme of grief and processing grief, and how, I mean, in Ireland, it's very much, as in my novel, there's very much focus on the wake and, you know, the funeral itself, and then the grave. And Mícheál Ó doesn't have that for her father because he disappeared. She doesn't know where he is or what's going on. But with Oona, I feel like there was a social sort of a death that was very neat and tidy. It met with social norms, or it a certain kind of level of manners. And then there would have been a funeral, and then there would have been then there's a silence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just such a void. How did you cope with that as a writer?
Yeah, well, I think what I was trying to do was to record what death is like or was like in certain suburbs in post-war America, where death was seen as a kind of failure. And I think part of the reason why I moved away from that kind of society was, and towards Ireland, is because, as people are talking a lot about right now, the Irish culture really does death a good service, you know? And it's really interesting to me what's going on right now, because I'm seeing so many people who are having to go without the rituals of death because of COVID-19. And it's making me think so much about what I was trying to write about in Oona, of what happens to people when they're denied, when death is denied, which isn't really the case happening here, but certainly the rituals of death are denied people, and the pain in that. And I think we come to see how much those rituals really mean, how much meaning they give to processing these things. In a sense, I think what's happening right now is showing us the rituals that we need for processing everyday life, like the ritual of sitting down to a meal. I mean, I don't know about you, but like the structure of my day is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I mean, I'm not drinking or drugging my way through this, you know, but I'm eating for sure. And it's just
somebody on social media said, I don't know about you, but I'm up to 7 meals a day. And I was like, yeah, 7 meals a day sounds about right. It's kind of like every 2 hours I need something to bring me back to, this is my body and this is where I am right now. And my husband stress cooks and stress bakes, so I'm in a very good place to have those needs met. But I think it's interesting. I think what's interesting about that is this idea of ritual. And I really love your protagonist is, you know, this sort of freshly minted American girl with all these, you know, on this kind of very old land. I mean, right, she's got that thing where, you know, the narrator is conscious, you know, that she's living on land that was somebody else's not so long ago. But this idea that she's a sort of freshly minted American, and she doesn't come encumbered with all the traditions and the narratives and the, you know, the funny languages. You've got all these grandparents kind of locked away in other rooms because they're speaking the funny original languages. Mm-hmm. And yet that's what she comes and seeks out. I mean, that's what she's finding comfort in. And definitely that's something I find that we're doing here. I'm taking comfort in anything I can do involving that's not involving baking, but DIY, you know, actually making and doing and mending, the sense of control. Because, you know, there's no, death is the big, you know, we don't have control. And with the lockdown, I found very much that idea that, well, if the only thing I can control today is planting a lettuce, then that actually might be what I do with my day. Or
and it's also physical, something you can do with your hands. You know, the DIY and the gardening and the bread baking and the things that people are doing. I think that is a massive comfort to people, that they can do something with their hands. And also humor. I mean, and I think that's something that in Big Girl, Small Town that I love so much, and that so many people have talked about that they love, is just the sense of humor in that book. And that is just how I'm tripping over myself. But for me, I can't love a piece of literature that doesn't have a real sense of wit and humor in it. You know, it's not real. It's not like life is. And I think there's a lot of humor in your book, And in this COVID situation too. I mean, somebody I think on Twitter said there's no AM or PM anymore. There's just coffee time and wine time.
Yeah, no, I could agree with that. Yeah, coffee to keep me fired up when there's daylight, and then when the sky begins to drain a bit, and there might be a glass of wine.
Totally.
Although we have, I mean, I've got 2 kids at home here, so I even find the both my parents are teachers, and there's a lot of teachers in my family, and I really decided not to go into teaching, and this lockdown has completely validated teaching was never my vocation. I'm definitely much happier writing. So there's that. I'm just thinking though, I mean, we met at the novel fair.
I wanted to chat about that.
Just over a year ago, and again, this is like this almost before and after. Like, I launched my book in February, when you could still have a book launch, right? You could still invite 150 people into a bookshop and, you know, hug and kiss them and drink wine and sign books.
Those were the days.
And then I remember, I'll take myself and my kids to London, and we'll bring them around on the underground. You know, we dragged my kids around, and right up until I think it was 2 days before we went into lockdown, I was on a radio show in a small studio with maybe 5 other people. I did a book signing that evening in our local bookshop, on our local newsagent in the town I grew up in, and then the Monday, everything had changed, but I remember that was the week Oona was having her launch. And I was watching it all happening on social media, because this suddenly was my window into the world, because I knew I wasn't going to be out doing things anymore.
Right.
And I was watching you doing your book signings. I was seeing you in bookshops, and I felt this kind of narrowing of the lens. I felt sort of the world shrinking.
It was. It was like being in a like a whirlpool going down a funnel, you know. And the week of that book launch, it was scheduled for a Thursday. It started out at the top of the funnel, the wide part, and I actually got out on a little tour of bookshops in Dublin and signed and met loads of wonderful bookshop owners. And that was so nice, because it was physical and material. I could see the books in the shops, and I could meet people and sign books and that kind of thing, and it was lovely. And then the day of the launch was the day that we in Ireland closed the schools, so we had to make a call, and we decided to cancel, which was the right decision. But it was just so strange. It really, you know, it just went, and but luckily, for a few weeks anyway, after the launch, bookshops were open. And I think the thing about publishing a book, unlike a lot of other things like a performance, a theatrical performance, or so many things that have gotten shut down, is we've made things that are physical and are lasting, you know.
Sure.
And when this is all over, they're going to still be there. They're not live performances that without an audience aren't going to be something, you know. So I'm grateful for that anyway, but it's still a hard time for everybody in the arts, you know. Yeah. But to go back to your novel fair, so we met at the Irish Writers Centre Novel Fair it was February in 2019.
February 2019, 15 writers, and I don't know how many publishers and agents in a very small room, not socially distanced.
I know, like completely unsocially distanced. Yeah.
We're all crammed together, if I remember correctly. And we were all very close to each other, trying to go, tell me about your novel. You know, I mean, it was quite different.
Yeah. And can you tell me what made you participate in the novel fair? Like, what was the story of your book getting to a publisher? And the novel fair, how that worked for you?
Well, you see, I started writing Big Girl Small Town, 13 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, I'm one of those, it took a long. So basically, I'd written a short story, and it came out, and it had a male protagonist. It was set in a chip shop. There was a disappeared father. There was an abusive mother, alcoholic, abusive mother. It had the Daly brothers. It had all the elements of Big Girl Small Town, but it had a male protagonist, and somehow I wasn't excited about him. I mean, he's a strong character in the short story, and The Stinging Fly picked the short story up and published it that autumn. But I had this sense that he had some sort of shadowy sidekick, some woman who was already there, who wasn't saying very much, and she was kind of fascinating. So I was of an age that I just stopped work for a month that November, sat down and wrote 70,000 words in a month, you know. So it just poured out. It was awesome. It took about 3 years to finish it. And then it took
70,000 words in 1 month, November.
Yeah.
And 3 years after that 70,000 to finish the rest.
Finish it, yeah.
Wow.
In fairness, I was a fairly distractible. I think I was early 30s at that point. But when I finished it, then it took, what was it, 10 years to find a publisher?
Wow.
So the novel fair was really quite extraordinary for me, because I'd been sending it out to agents and publishers and actually really not getting any kind of strong response in Ireland. But when I sent it to people in New York or London, anytime I sent it out, I'd always have somebody engaged with me, coming back and talking to me, telling me what they really, really liked about it. But there was a question I just kept stumbling on, and everybody would say, well, you know, what's wrong with Mícheál? And I was like, Mícheála's just Mícheál. She's just a bit weird. She's just Mícheál. But in the year before the novel fair, a female relative of mine got a very late diagnosis of autism, and I was very familiar with the male presentation, but I decided to go off and look into the female presentation. And as soon as I started reading it, a lot made sense to me, and I realized that a lot of Mícheála's behaviors would be, you know, typical female presentation of autism.
Definitely, yeah.
And this was kind of a really big flash of understanding for me. So I sat down that July. I was working, but my husband took the kids away for 3 weeks, and I rewrote it in July, submitted it to the novel fair, because it is the place to fast track your novel. I think in terms of Irish and English publishing, you can do yourself no better favor than to try and get shortlisted or become a finalist. Totally. Because instead of spending, I don't know, years as I did, you can sit down in a room, you will meet 15 people who may or may not go for it, but they're going to give you as much feedback as you feel brave enough to take. And it was a complete fast track for me. And I had a really good feeling when I was shortlisted, and I had a really good feeling on the day, and it was kind of stressful but amazing. I mean, I'd never spent a day talking about my writing ever in my life.
Yeah, not enough.
Glorious.
Yeah.
And how did you find it?
Well, and also just to finish up, you got such an amazing, you got out of it a wonderful publisher, an amazing editor in Becky Walsh, and a literary agent as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, when I met Becky, I was at the novel fair, I thought, I want Becky. It's just, there was something about the dynamic there. And then I read Elmet, the Mcgarry shortlisted novel that she'd edited. And I loved how brave she is as an editor. And there's something about like claustrophobic worlds. And I think Oona has this as well, these worlds that are very intensely felt and very intensely brightly painted. And as soon as I read Elmet, I knew that Becky wasn't scared of these words. She wasn't going to dilute what Mícheál Ó was, and she wasn't going to dilute the world. And as a, you know, she's been incredibly supportive. She's amazing. And yeah, so the book just seemed, after taking so long, Alice, to get out there, it just seems to have gone really well.
And it after taking so long to get out there, from the time that you signed with them to the time that the book actually was launched and like beautifully designed and marketed and beautifully publicized, and it's gotten such an amazing reception. I mean, it really has it just seems like a perfect kind of story of publication.
Yeah, no, it still feels a little surreal. And even the fact that I did get to have a book launch, and I did get to do the tour, I got to do the book things that I'd been dreaming of for quite some time. So I do think it's an interesting, I mean, I think that you kind of had the first lockdown book launch, the first socially distant book launch in Ireland, you know? So you got to do this kind of wide lens to absolute, you know, the spotlight being very small and being here, but also I love the way that people have been changing how we use social media and changing how we promote books. And there is actually this is what we're doing, you know,
right now.
Because I think we'd scheduled ourselves a cheeky cup of tea in Sligo, but we
Right. Doing this instead.
Yeah, so I love it.
It's so nice, because it was great to meet you at the novel fair. And yeah, I mean, just in terms of my story with the novel fair, you know, with poetry publishing, it's just a totally different story. And when this turned out to, you know, what I was writing turned out to be a novel, I was really a novice at how to go about publishing it. And as it always seems to be the case with me, it was just kind of like, oh, it just came across my consciousness, this novel fair from the Irish Writers Centre. And I just thought, oh, well, that sounds like a really good way to, as you say, just fast track this whole process. Because I'm not great at schmoozing. It's certainly not my strength. You know, a little bit of an introvert. So I just thought, well, let's try it. And so it was so wonderful to be shortlisted, and then, yeah, to get some training into how to talk about a book.
Sure.
That was really great. That day that we all met, before we met, you know, before the speed dating with all the agents and publishers, where we got some coaching. That was really helpful to me, because I think for me, the idea of doing an elevator pitch on a book was really scary. The idea of me fitting in some way into the marketplace was really scary. And it was like, how am I going to do this in a way that feels authentic? And in a way that just feels like me, because I wanted to engage, but I wanted to engage in a way that just felt right. And so the novel fair, I felt space in the novel fair for being able to do that. And it was great. I just felt relaxed. And it was amazing when I met Anthony Farrell from Lilliput. He was the first one that I met. And then the story with them was, it just went very quickly. Within 24 hours, he came back and said, would I consider holding the manuscript for them? And that was really great. And then there was other interest as well. And I decided to go with Lilliput for a number of reasons. And one of them is that they're based here. And it's been such a great experience for me working with them. So it was the right decision all the way through. And
oh, that's amazing. And what is it Lilliput say? They only publish the books they think, it's something about how they publish books that they think should be there for the next 100 years or the next 200 years or something. They're not publishing out of any, let's have a commercial, we need to have a massive hit, although that's always nice. But this is about Lilliput publish what they really and truly believe in. It is not a gigantic machine, it's an indie press. It's
totally. Yeah. It's a passion driven publisher for sure. And they picked up another author this year at the novel fair, Estelle Birdie.
Oh wow, yeah.
We're going to publish her novel. It's called Raveling with them, I guess, in 2021. So that's another good novel fair story. And hopefully,
I met Estelle briefly at one. I think the novel. They asked me to come back and help with the novel pitch prep day, which again, it reminded me very much of us all sitting in a room, kind of going, "What do you mean? What is my novel about?" So all that was really great training. So you wrote. So you moved from poetry into writing books. So how long did it take you to write, Oona? Because I am interested.
Yeah, it took me 4 years. Yeah. 4 years of, kind of short spurts often. And then I had 1 year of a fellowship where I could really concentrate, where I didn't have any other job and no teaching, just writing for a focused 9 months, which was really, really important.
That sounds heavenly.
It was.
I've done 30 days once, and when my husband took my kids to France for 3 weeks, again, that's constraints, right? I had 3 weeks, and I did have a 9-to-5 job, but I had 3 weeks where I knew my mornings and my evenings were entirely my own. And that it was the first time in in years that I time to myself. You know that bit where you have kids and move around a lot and everything's so compressed. It was the first point I remember sitting down, and I do think that that's a great gift that an artist can get, is that gift of confined time, if you know what I mean, constrained time, to be able to say, this is your only thing you have to do, but it's not going to go on indefinitely. There is a kind of a time limit here that
definitely
constraint.
So I want to ask you before we wrap up, what's next? What are you doing? I have a sense you're well into your second novel, yeah?
So the second, I have a first draft of the second novel, and it's called Factory Girls, and it's set in a very small town again, a border town, and it's set the summer of the ceasefire in a shirt factory. And I worked in a shirt factory one summer, and so there's a lot of personal experience in it, in terms of the world and in terms of, how factories run, in terms of the sort of the political climate, the cultural scene. All of that is very familiar to me. So I've really enjoyed writing that, and I'm trying at the minute to work my way through the second draft. And oddly, on the side, something else is knitting itself. I don't even know what it is, but somehow I find that when I go to do the hard work of a second draft, because I find that harder than writing, then this other thing pops its head up and says, yeah, but you could just write 500 words of me, and then you get loads of satisfaction before you go into the editing stuff. So it's almost like I'm bribing myself by letting myself write this other thing, don't know what it is.
Great.
But it's writing itself while I'm editing Factory Girls. And so, it feels amazing to have a book out after all this time. And to have one that I'm trying to pull do you know when it's corset and you want it to kind of I don't know what that word is, but tighten it up. And then this other thing knitting itself on the side is really interesting. What about you? What are you working on? That was a big question that was I've been wanting to ask since the start.
There's something bubbling away as well in me, but it isn't. I'm nowhere near ending a first draft. All I know is that that it's centered on sisters, that there's a sisterhood, and it keeps going. I'm not sure where it's set. Poland is a very important place to me, and there's a story of two sisters in wartime Poland that I've kind of started writing, but it's still too early to kind of say whether that's going to stick or whether that will fall away. But it's definitely sisters.
I have 3 sisters, and my novel features a family of 5 sisters, and how that works as well. Again, absence being a key thing. But I love the idea of exploring how your siblings give you a sense of who you are and where you are. I mean, these big Irish families, I'm one of 6, right? 6 kids, and where you come in the family, and the kind of atmosphere in your family at all the different stages is very important. Maybe you try reading Discomfort of Evening, because it's really interesting, very atmospheric story of a family who lose a sibling very early on in the book, and how that reverberates.
Okay, definitely. I'll
definitely
put that on my list.
For
sure. So Michelle, thank you so much for chatting with me. I love chatting with you. And just to wrap up, maybe I'll say that both our books are available as ebooks right now, which during lock-in is probably the easiest way for people to get them, on Amazon and Kobe and wherever else you can get ebooks. Hold up, Big Girl, Small Town.
Yeah, chips.
I love that. Do you know who did that drawing?
Sarah Marafini is a graphic designer. She's freelance. She's based in London, and she does a lot of stuff for Hassett. So I finally got to meet her. I got to meet her when I was in London back in the days when you could jump on a plane and go somewhere. So I got to meet her and I was thrilled. I think the cover is amazing.
Yeah, it's such a great cover. Love it. Love it.
Oh, so I love your cover. Oh my, this cover, you know, I'm a failed art student. This cover makes me want to go and get my art palette, which I never threw out, and get back to it. And yeah, it's something we didn't explore in the conversation, but that kind of the artist side of it, you know, is fascinating. So yeah, I think actually, Alice, I have been in lockdown too long, and I would just sit here all day talking to another grown-up, a grown-up person who hasn't asked me to make a Lego Brontosaurus.
I know, it's actually so nice for me to be talking to a human being and not like being on Twitter.
Yeah, no, I know people who move and they're not speaking in pithy one-liners. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me to your virtual book tour. I have loved it. Thank you,
Michelle. Loved it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mike Chinoy, and I'm the author of this new book, Are You With Me? Kevin Boyle and the Rise of the Human Rights Movement. The book is a biography of the late Professor Kevin Boyle, who was a very distinguished human rights lawyer and activist who worked on many issues both in Ireland and around the world. One of Boyle's great causes was freedom of expression, and in the late 1980s, he was the founding director of a freedom of expression NGO called Article 19, where he found himself in the middle of the extremely tense clash that erupted when Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini condemned the British writer Salman Rushdie to death, claiming that Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses, was un-Islamic. What I'd like to do today is to read a brief excerpt from my book that talks about Boyle's role in this controversy. I had hoped to be doing a reading like this in person at bookstores in Ireland and in England and elsewhere, but unfortunately due to the coronavirus outbreak, that hasn't been possible. So I'm doing this remotely, sitting in my living room here in Hong Kong, where I live. In retrospect, the Salman Rushdie affair would come to be seen as the opening salvo in what became an enduring theme of the years that followed, the clash between Islamic extremism and Western liberal democracy. In its passions and bloodshed, it was a foretaste of the mistrust, tension, and conflict that would characterize so much of the West's subsequent dealing with the Islamic world. It created a climate of heightened pressure and violence, targeting both liberal thinkers in Islamic nations and critics of extremist Islam in the West. Rushdie's Japanese and Italian translators were killed. His Norwegian publisher was shot 3 times but survived. Liberal imams in Brussels were murdered. Bombs went off in bookstores in central London. 6 days after Ayatollah Khomeini's declaration, Kevin Boyle organized an emergency meeting at the headquarters of the National Union of Journalists in London. In addition to members of Article 19, those in attendance included representatives from the NUJ, Index on Censorship, the International Writers Organization PEN, the Writers Guild of Great Britain, and the Publishers Association. Denouncing the fatwa as, quote, armed censorship, they decided to form the International Committee for the Defense of Salman Rushdie and his publishers, with Boyle as the chair. For Boyle, who deeply believed that freedom of expression was a universal value which underpinned all the other freedoms he'd spent his life defending, the fatwa, the Ayatollah's death threat, was a threat that had to be resisted, whatever the personal risks. There are times in all our lives when you wish it was otherwise, he wrote later, but you take up the challenge. A few days later, Boyle, the chair of Article 19's board, the writer William Shawcross, influential British playwright Harold Pinter, who in 2005 would win the Nobel Prize for Literature, Pinter's wife, the historian Lady Antonia Fraser, and a few others gathered in an ornate meeting room at the House of Commons. they decided to draft a letter in support of Rushdie and to seek the signatures of as many writers and intellectuals as possible before publishing it in newspapers and magazines around the world. It was crucial that the writing community, the literary world, should rally to Rushdie's defense, recalled Arya Nair, the founder of Human Rights Watch. Had that not happened, the impact of the fatwa and the physical attacks on people who were associated with Rushdie's book would have had a far more devastating impact on freedom of expression. Boyle took the lead in drafting the document. With the help of Shawcross, Pinter, and others, they reached out to as many Nobel Prize winners as they could. Within 10 days, they had 1,000 signatures. There were 5 winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature, including Boyle's hero, the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. 7 others who signed would subsequently be awarded the prize, among them Kazuo Ishiguro, Doris Lessing, Maria Vargas Llosa, and Boyle's old friend from Belfast, the poet Seamus Heaney. Other notables included Graham Greene, Norman Mailer, Elie Wiesel, V.S. Pritchett, and John Hersey. Significantly, a half-dozen exiled Iranian writers signed, as did authors from Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It was a striking rebuff to the argument that freedom of expression was a purely Western notion. Although the letter itself was barely 100 words, Boyle spent hours refining it. The document was very much a reflection of his values and sensitivities. On 14 February, it began, the Ayatollah Khomeini called on all Muslims to seek out and execute Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, and those involved in its publication worldwide. We, the undersigned, insofar as we defend the right to freedom of opinion and expression as embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declare that we are also involved in the publication. The next sentence acknowledged the strength of feeling against Rushdie. We appreciate the distress the book has aroused and deeply regret the loss of life associated with the ensuing conflict. To Article 19 staffer Matthew Piet, this was typical of Boyle. Kevin was very strong on issues of religious freedom because of his experience in the Troubles. He wanted to accommodate the fact that there were intensely held beliefs on the other side. I think that was signature Kevin. The letter contained 2 appeals. One was to world opinion, to support the right of all people to express their ideas and beliefs and to discuss them with their critics on the basis of mutual tolerance, free from censorship, intimidation, and violence. The other appeal was to world leaders to, quote, continue to repudiate the threats made against Salman Rushdie and those involved in the book's publication worldwide. On the 2nd of March, the letter was published in 62 newspapers and magazines around the world. A press conference was held in London to publicize the document. Boyle told reporters that its publication was an unprecedented event that gave an opportunity for writers all across the world to speak in one voice for freedom of the imagination and in defense of Salman Rushdie. Privately, he was thrilled. It was one of the world's greatest coordinated protests, he wrote years later. 1,000 signatures. Think of the challenge of agreeing a statement and responding. The letter made Article 19 a voice for Rushdie, who remained in hiding, and Boyle became the public face of the campaign and thus a potential target. That took a hell of a lot of courage, Boyle's old friend Burt Lockwood observed. He was quite visible. As Matthew Piet recalled, we were at risk because we were effectively representing Rushdie. We did receive threats. Although it didn't happen, there was talk of having a policeman stationed outside the Article 19 office because it was quite dangerous. Yet Boyle never let on to his colleagues or his family that he was worried. Kevin would have handled that, Piet said. He was very good at protecting us from anxiety. Boyle's wife, Joan, had a similar recollection. Kevin was so swept along by the excitement and the effort of creating the initiative that I am not sure he ever felt in danger. I do not recall being particularly frightened. In July, Boyle organized a press conference held at the Institute of Contemporary Arts on the Mall in central London with Harold Pinter, Kazuo Ishiguro, the playwright Arnold Wesker, and Francis de Souza, who would soon succeed him as director of Article 19. During the previous months, Article 19 had continued to collect signatures for the letter. Boyle showed reporters what was now a book-length document signed by over 12,000 writers and intellectuals from 67 countries. Despite the show of support, the news conference was a tense occasion. People were very jittery, recalled Francis de Souza. Harold Pinter was very jittery about being photographed by the press because he might get targeted. Boyle read a message from Rushdie in which the writer, making one of his first public comments since going into hiding, acknowledged the number of letters of support he'd received from Muslims and tried to strike a positive note, saying the process of mutual understanding with Islam will continue, leading to reconciliation. It was a hope Boyle strongly shared. Throughout this process, Boyle had no direct contact with Rushdie, communicating again through intermediaries. The two men did not meet until January 1993, when Rushdie made a heavily guarded appearance at a conference on freedom of expression that Boyle organized in Dublin. Years later, Rushdie expressed regret at not getting to know Kevin better, but remained deeply appreciative, in his words, of the efforts Boyle and Article 19 had made on his behalf. It would take almost a decade before post-Khomeini Iran backtracked on the threat sufficiently for Salman Rushdie to resume the semblance of a normal life. But the religious and political fault lines exposed by his case became more acute, and the challenge of responding to terrorism and authoritarian governments in a way that preserved fundamental values like the right to freedom of expression became more complex. Even though the press conference was Boyle's last official event, both at Article 19 and as chair of the Rushdie Support Committee, he now handed both roles over to Francis de Souza as he prepared to resume his academic career at the University of Essex. They were issues that would remain central to his work for the rest of his life. I hope that gives you a bit of a taste of Kevin Boyle the man and the kind of remarkable experiences that he had throughout his life. In these grim times with so many of us stuck at home, I hope at least some of you will find it of sufficient interest to try and order the book and learn something more about this remarkable and inspiring man. Thanks very much for joining me.
My name is Conor O'Cleary. I'm a former foreign correspondent of the Irish Times, and I'm here to talk with Mike Chinoy about his new book, Are You With Me?, about the human rights lawyer Kevin Boyle, who came from Northern Ireland. Now, Mike, first thing I'd like to say is that I've enjoyed your company in two different parts of the world. We met during the Troubles in the early 1970s when both of us were reporting in Belfast. And then we met again in China when I was Beijing correspondent and you were the CNN correspondent for China, and very well known for your role in reporting the Tiananmen Square massacre, and also for being a frequent visitor to North Korea when that wasn't possible for most of us. So Mike, you've written a book which I really like very much. It's you've brought to life a pioneering human rights lawyer and activist that we know about in Ireland, but not enough. And but Mike, your name isn't very well known in Ireland, apart from the time when you were here covering the Troubles. Tell me something about yourself.
Well, I was a foreign correspondent for CNN for almost 25 years and worked for a couple of the other American TV networks before that, mostly based in Asia. I lived in Hong Kong and in Beijing and covered the Asia Pacific region and other points beyond, but in the 70s and 80s, as you mentioned, I did cover the Troubles. Since I left CNN a number of years ago, I'm affiliated with a think tank at the University of Southern California looking at US-China relations, and I live in Hong Kong, but I have maintained my longstanding interest in Northern Ireland.
Well, I presume, Mike, that it was in Northern Ireland that you first met Kevin Boyle. Tell me about how you met Kevin Boyle and how your relationship with him developed over the years.
I first got to know Kevin Boyle when he was a visiting scholar at Yale University during the 1972-73 academic year. I was in my final year at Yale, and I had been involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement and civil rights movement in the States, so I had followed with great interest the progress of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland. So when he came to Yale, we met, and I asked if he would be willing to supervise me in a kind of independent study course on sort of topics in Irish history. So we met every week for a full academic year. He would assign me readings. We got to be friends, and he also became something of an intellectual mentor to me as I sought to understand what was going on in Ireland. And then later, as I began my journalistic career, as you mentioned, coming in and out of Northern Ireland quite a bit in the mid-70s, I often stayed with him, and he was very, very helpful. What I didn't know during that first year that I kind of got to know him was that he had come to Yale, and I only discovered this in researching the book, because he'd gotten sort of burned out with the way the violence in the North had sort of eclipsed the political struggle for civil rights that he'd been very deeply involved in the early stages, and seeing there was no longer a space for street politics, political activity. He came to Yale for a year to recharge his batteries and try and find another way he could play a role in Northern Ireland, and he did indeed find that by getting involved in various legal cases, trying to use the law as a tool to rectify injustices in the North. But none of that was known to me at the time. We simply were friends, and he was an important intellectual mentor.
Mike, you described in very great and very interesting detail the role of Kevin Boyle in the early stages of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, where he was a leading figure. And his role there has been very, very highly regarded by historians looking back in the 1970s period as a constructive role, and somebody who always sought to seek peaceful resolution rather than get involved in other activities. Now, Mike, I must say that to us in Ireland, Kevin Boyle is a name that we remember from the Troubles. But your book brings out his role after leaving Northern Ireland in the area of legal and human rights as a lawyer. And this is a role which most of us don't know about, because a lot of it was behind the scenes. A lot of it was advising, even advising Margaret Thatcher and the Irish government on legal issues, issues of human rights. Tell us something about that, because this is a revelation to me, and I'm sure will be to readers of your book.
Kevin Boyle was a very interesting man, because he did all these amazing things, but he didn't like to talk about them. And so even as I knew him over the years, I only had a kind of faint notion of the range of things that he was involved in. And it was only after his death in 2010, when his wife gave all his papers to NUI Galway, and I began to go through them, that it became clear not only the range and impact of what he did on Irish issues, because it turns out I discovered that he was involved in a previously unknown effort to mediate the 1981 IRA hunger strikes. He was involved in efforts to help lay the intellectual foundation for the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which in turn helped create the sort of the template for the Belfast Agreement, peace agreement of 1998. But unlike many of his contemporaries who became known through their role in the civil rights movement, he branched out beyond Northern Ireland and beyond Ireland generally, and he ended up as a lawyer in the European Court of Human Rights, taking and winning numerous landmark cases involving press freedom, gay rights, defending people who had been detained and tortured, who'd been subjected to rape and other state-sanctioned violence. He became a vocal advocate for freedom of the press, and one of the things I learned was that he, in 1980, late 1986, early 1987, took over a new freedom of press NGO called Article 19, which was set up to do for freedom of expression what Amnesty International did or was doing for prisoners of conscience. And in that role, first of all, he built Article 19 into an important NGO that's still very active today. but he played an important, vital role in organizing and leading the campaign to defend the writer Salman Rushdie when Rushdie was threatened with death by Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini at considerable personal risk. I'd never heard him talk about this. I had no idea that he was involved in it, but it became clear going through thousands of papers in his archive. That was one of the really important things that he did.
Well, this is a role that we in Ireland, and I'm sure readers of your book in other parts of the world would not be very aware of. And he also got involved in civil rights issues in Turkey.
Again, this was something I knew very little about, but in the 1990s, as Turkey was trying to join the EU, Boyle was a very important figure in bringing cases before the European Court of Human Rights on behalf of the beleaguered Kurdish minority in southeastern Turkey. The Kurds have been the targets of Turkish government repression for decades. Even in recent months, they've been targeted again by the Turkish military. But Boyle, working with a couple of other lawyers, brought dozens of cases throughout the 1990s on behalf of the Kurdish villagers whose villages had been destroyed, on behalf of people who'd been arrested and tortured in detention. There was one very dramatic case involving a 17-year-old girl who had been arrested and raped in prison, and over tremendous objections from the Turkish authorities, who tried at every step of the way to sabotage this case. It was brought to Strasbourg, and the European Court of Human Rights issued a very important ruling that rape could be considered kind of a war crime, a crime against humanity, and that was important in terms of paving the way for the international tribunals that looked at the genocide in Rwanda or the massacres in the former Yugoslavia. And at the same time, what was striking to me was that Boyle was simultaneously acting as a pioneer in creating the idea that human rights law and human rights should become a feature of an important academic discipline. And he first set up the Center for Human Rights at NUI Galway, and then he built up the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, where he taught for the last 20 years.
Because there's a very interesting line in your book where you say if human rights was a religion, the University of Essex would have been a seminary. And this was because, partly because of Kevin Boyle's role in promoting and educating the legal profession, especially about the need for legal representation in human rights issues.
I think that's true. He had a very interesting idea about teaching human rights and human rights law, which was that you could train people in law, not just to become lawyers to buy and sell houses or sign, contracts for shipping merchandise, but to really play a role in society. And so, especially at the Human Rights Center at Essex is really the world's leading center for training people in human rights law. And if you scratch the surface today, or in the last few years, of almost any of the big international human rights NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the various human rights courts in Strasbourg and elsewhere, human rights commissions, you'll find so many of his students in Europe, in Asia, in South America, who took what he taught them, and he was seen by them as this kind of beloved guide and mentor, and have then themselves become very important actors in the battle which goes on today for human rights.
Well, Mike, I must say, I thought I'd read every good book written about Northern Ireland or people involved in the Northern Ireland Troubles. And you've proved me wrong. This is a wonderful book about a most fascinating and courageous character whom we deserve to know more about. And I hope that your book sells extremely well, because it's a wonderful read. It's beautifully written, and I congratulate you and I congratulate your publishers on bringing it out.
Thanks very much, Conor. I should just, it's worth ending by noting we're having this conversation because I couldn't travel from Hong Kong, where I live, to Ireland and England to launch the book because of the coronavirus epidemic. And Kevin Boyle, over 30 years ago, writing about the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, wrote that full freedom of information is not a luxury, but may literally be a matter of life and death. And since the coronavirus has spread in part because the Chinese authorities covered up the early stages of the outbreak, because President Donald Trump belittled it as a hoax, because other governments haven't been transparent about it, it just struck me that here, this is another example of how Kevin Boyle was a kind of visionary figure who sensed way before his time the importance of issues that are still with us today. And I think that's another reason why the book is still highly relevant.
Well, Mike, as someone who has written 2 books about China, 1 book about North Korea, now a book about a civil rights lawyer from Ireland, I hope maybe someday you'll write a book about the use and the value of information in the coronavirus in the year of the plague. Thank you very much, Mike. It's been a pleasure as always to talk to you, and I hope we meet again soon physically.
All right. Thanks very much, Conor. Take care.
My name's Adrian Duncan. I'm an Irish writer. My new novel, A Sabbatical in Leipzig, is out at the moment in Ireland. And this week I was supposed to do a launch in Dubray Books in Grafton Street. But instead I'm going to read to you from my balcony in my apartment in Berlin. So I'm unable to do the launch in Ireland. So Ruth at Lilliput Press came up with the nice idea that I might do a reading and post it online or something like that, and at least people can listen to some part of the book. So basically the book is told in first person, present tense, and it's told through the eyes of a man called Michael Pura, who's, I would say he's in his probably mid to late 70s. He's a retired bridge engineer. He's lived away from Ireland for many, many years, and he lives now in Bilbao on his own. His partner died 6 years previous in Leipzig, which was the city that they had lived in previously. The whole book itself is about an hour of Michael's life. It's a morning, one particular morning, in that kind of strange period of time between when you have your kind of last coffee or tea in the morning and before you leave the house for the day to do whatever it is that you're going to do. And because Michael is retired, that period of time, which for a lot of people is quite rushed, but for him is quite leisurely, and on this particular morning he has these particular thoughts, and that's basically what the book is, his thoughts over the course of an hour. So I'm going to read about 4 pages now. Okay. I've been waking early these last few days. The mornings here in Bilbao are early and light, and I find myself rising well before 6 and standing in the kitchen of my apartment, looking out the window and into the courtyard below. My window faces west, and sometimes at this hour the morning light reflects off one of the east-facing windows a few stories up on the building across the courtyard from me. The light is not so strong that I can't look into it. I can look into it for a few moments longer than if I were attempting to look directly into the sun. I sometimes think if I could arrange the windows on the east-facing facade and the corresponding windows that share my west-facing facade in such a way that for a few moments each morning I could redirect the sun a couple of times over and back across the courtyard and into my window, then, while standing here in my kitchen, I could peer into the light for a few moments longer. The delicacy of this arrangement of angles would mean that the sun's alignment with them would be more fleeting than if I were relying on just one window to redirect the sun towards me. The windows receiving light from each other in this way would slide more quickly out of coalescence, but I believe the closer the complicated arrangement of windows would bring the chances of me seeing the light, and the length of time I might witness this light, to zero, then, I believe, the more beautiful I would consider this light. Light I consider to be already quite lovely. I don't know my neighbours. but I'm sure if I asked them, they might collaborate with me, and we could achieve the various angles of incidence required for me to stand for those few moments longer in my kitchen looking into the rising sun. If my neighbours on both the west and east side of the courtyard agreed on this arrangement of windows, and all of us were agreed to rise at the appointed time on a clear morning to witness our lines of light experiment, we could then convene down in the courtyard after the sun had disappeared and listen to how each person's experience of this light had made them feel. Their responses, though, would surely only suggest to me further questions. I then would find myself considering the quality of the glass in each person's window. I would ask myself, were some windows double glazed, some single glazed, some recently replaced, recently cleaned, both inside and out? What might the iron content in the glass be? How was each pane of glass cast? And what were the conditions of the casting and cooling? How might all of these factors have affected the zigzagging channel of light over and back across our courtyard? And what sorts of losses might have occurred in this transmission? But more so, I might then learn something about my neighbour's character by virtue of the care they show to and the knowledge they have of their kitchen windows. A few instances ago I took up the same spot I'd assumed the last few mornings at this time, but the window across the way that usually reflects the whitened sunlight into my eyes was itself not hosting the sun. It sat instead on the edge of some unearthly luminescence. I stepped a couple of feet to my left, and the reflected sun slid into view. Last night was warm, and I realized this neighbour across the way must have wedged open their kitchen window to allow the cooler air to circulate through their apartment as they slept. Then, a few leaves belonging to the expansive chestnut tree in our courtyard bobbed down into view, interrupting the light reflecting off my neighbour's window, and this protected my eyes from the pain of slight overexposure I usually feel when I look for too long directly into the reflected light. The shadows of these bobbing leaves were being cast onto the dust on the outer face of my window pane. I looked at the shadows a while as the bright flicker of the sun in the near and not so near distance came and went. I could not tell if I was looking at the movement of these many phenomena landing onto the dusty glass, or if I was looking at the stillness of the sheet of glass itself as it partly received and admitted this movement. This morning I woke suddenly with a pain in my knee. This happens often when I sleep on my stomach. I rolled onto my back to relieve the pain, and as I lay there, a flow of mental particles depicting elements of buildings from my past appeared before me. After some time I decided that it is high time for these constructions of mine to be compiled and surveyed. I am too old, though, to do this survey. I cannot travel to these places, and if I could, I would not be able to access the nooks and crannies of each building and bridge I would need to access to carry out a survey thorough enough to ease my worries. As this thought unspooled, the name of the last place I lived in, the city of Leipzig, came to mind, especially the dot over the letter I near the centre of the word, and I either moved towards it, or it expanded concentrically towards me until it filled my field of vision. Then, realizing the pain in my knee was unlikely to abate, I rose. During the last few years of my career I mentored a young Danish engineer. I think of him often in the morning, before I have my coffee and while I comb my hair. I think of the exemplary way that he could see. I do not know if he is alive or where he is now or what he might look like, but I am sure he is the only person I would trust with carrying out a survey of this kind for me. I take a sip from my coffee and look back out the kitchen window. I can see the whole courtyard darken menacingly, then brighten again. A bird flies overhead. Its shadow runs up the rippling tree, like a small dark animal fleeing the ground. Okay, well, whoever made it this far, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon.